perhaps we can start sort of looking at where the project began, and sort of, talk about its beginnings.
Mm-hmm. Well, it began really as two completely separate things in my kind of list of things I need to do, which is usually how I work. I have lists of stuff that I want to work on, and there were these two very separate things. One was wanting to do something with the writing of Paul Bowles, and also his kind of protege Mohamed Merabit, who's a Moroccan writer who when he was around about 20 met Jane Bowles, started telling her some stories, and she said, "Oh, you need to meet Paul, my husband, and maybe he can translate these." And so they had this very long kind of relationship of Bowles translating Merabit, but according to Merabit, also Bowles kind of taking quite a few ideas and making them his own. That history is completely open to question. Merabit has a very particular point of view about that. So there was this thing, and then on the other, completely separately, I really wanted to make a film about filmmaking, about the apparatus, about this kind of drama of the kind of craziness that goes into making films, and but wanting to do it in such a way that what we're looking at, the kind of levels of reality of what you're looking at kind of become hazy. And there weren't so many models for this. There's a lot of models for films about filmmaking, but they tend to either be observational documentaries about films being made, like Heart of Darkness, about Apocalypse Now, or Burden of Dreams, about Fitzcarraldo, and that there's a long list of those. Or they're more definitely like fiction. Fictional accounts of films being made, and The State of Things, Wim Wenders, or Le Mépris. There's lots. But there was one film that was a really important model for me, because it was one that kind of came much closer to what I was thinking about, which was this Spanish film by Per Portobello from 1970 called Vampire Coup de Choc. And it's a film that Per Portobello made kind of behind the scenes of Jess Franco making his Dracula movie with Christopher Lee, and it's an example of where Per Portobello as a filmmaker is kind of using this existing thing that's happening, but it moves beyond being observational. It's kind of taking these things and making them his own. It's never meant to be like a factual kind of account, and I really liked that kind of translation, and so that was a really important kind of model for me, and we'll look at that soon. So I had these two separate things, and didn't know what films I wanted to make a film about, but I knew they needed to be films that were happening. I thought, and then just by chance, two very good friends, Shezad and Oliver, both were starting to work on their productions, which were both happening in Morocco. So, Morocco, Paul Bowles, Mohamed Merabit, it'd be crazy to not try and put those things together. So that was really the starting block, and that was what I went to Artangel with, this idea of trying to bring these different elements together. and then kind of go about persuading these friends to let me come on board, which was, well, I don't know, maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah. What was your first kind of reaction when Ben asked you?
It was a kind of, I'd like to say firmly no, but maybe to give some background, I think, when Ben and I aren't off on location or kind of working on exhibitions, when we're both in London, we tend to meet once a week for lunch and discuss film, and usually kind of ideas for deconstructing film. And, this idea of meta-cinema is something that's definitely, if not every week, but it's certainly kind of popped up often enough. And I think, given our kind of shared interests and discussions, it was that, oh God, I'd like to say, I really want to say no to this, but I actually can't, because I'd be kind of taking back our conversations of the last however many years, where we talk, because we're quite sort of, I suppose in that way, only two artists can talk more freely about appropriations, away from the kind of structures of production that sometimes go around our films. We can talk about more kind of free-form ideas about revealing structure, piracy, appropriations, how to kind of actually play with not so much the meat, but the bones of cinema, and kind of reconfigure them to make new skeletons. So in that way, it was like, God damn you, I wish I'd found a way to ask you first. But, I had to sort of go, I had no choice but to go with it.
Mm-hmm. And were there any restrictions or anything that you sort of, or like, was there any kind of conversations beforehand where you sort of decided, we talked to Ben about what he would do on set, or was he given completely free rein?
I think there was a sort of, desire on my part to follow through and give complete free rein, but obviously there had to be some kind of limits in terms of if it actually kind of frustrated my ability to make my film, then that would be a problem. So there was, it's funny because our relationship is very, 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 very free and open, and we definitely went through a few months of awkwardness.
Yeah.
Setting up sort of limits that sort of go against the very nature of our conversation, but that almost had to be in place, not just for our own sake, possibly for the sake of our continued friendship, but also for the sake of our relationships with the organisations that were, generously supporting us and bringing it together. So it was not just a level of trust between us, but say Film and Video Umbrella, who produced my film, allowing for that openness too. So I think it's not just me who put myself on the block. They very much did that as well, because it was, I think, mine was one of the most expensive productions they've done. So then to kind of allow it to be sort of cannibalized in a way was very, hats off to them for sort of understanding the process, the kind of the intellectual inquiry that was behind it, and kind of really backing that.
I mean, one thing we didn't talk about before was Carlos Santos, and I suppose his place in your installation in Artangel, which he has.
Yeah. So the soundtrack to Vampire Kudachuk is made by a Catalan artist, composer, performer, Carlos Santos, and when I was editing this part of the project, the part where I'm filming Shezad, I was thinking about trying to get a contemporary artist, composer to make something that was kind of along the same lines as this, that kind of was an echo of it. But while I was editing, I just decided to put it on top, the original 1970 soundtrack on top of mine, and it was just perfect. It just felt perfect, and I just thought it kind of furthered this idea of appropriation and kind of, it's essentially like stealing, but making something your own. and so Michael from Artangel got in touch with Carlos because they'd worked together many years before, and he was happy for me to use it, to reuse it, and I think he got it as an idea. So I just stuck with it, and it's just such a fantastic soundtrack because it's some of it's kind of musical, but then it moves into this kind of more abstract kind of. You don't really know what's happening, and it helps kind of create some kind of distance to the image, which I think, something that we talked about was, certainly in terms of me helping to persuade Shezad was, that my film was really going to sort of, be aesthetically very different, and to have this kind of distance, using long lenses, so that I'm not like right on top of people all the time. And
was that part of the reason why you used black and white as well?
It was. I mean, that was one reason. I think I always knew I wanted to shoot this part in black and white because I was interested, partly in what Shezad has told me about his film and how it kind of moves sort of backwards and forwards in time. You're not really sure at what point we're getting at. It's the future, but then it's also like referring to things, ancient things, which Shez can talk about it in a moment. But I was sort of thinking about the same thing, that this thing that I was making was some kind of record that you would be very difficult to kind of place in time. That it has this kind of maybe an aesthetic of the past, but it's also, is it a kind of capsule that's been sent from the future, washed up in this seascape that we're both filming in. So yeah, and it has, it's hand processed, so it has all this kind of like, watery texture.
It does sort of feel like a bit like a sort of silent film in parts, where I think there's one bit where there's sort of woman running into the cave, and that I suppose is a bit like Kulichuk, because he was sort of very much drawing on Dreya's Vampire and Nosferatu as well. Right? Yeah. So Shezad, how did you feel when you watched Ben's film? How does that?
I mean, it's interesting because I've particularly in my earlier films, just because of budgetary constraints, I'd often perform in them. So I've got no problem with seeing myself in that way, or I've taught on film schools for years, so there's no problem about the sort of public thing. But actually, I was really felt awkward about being revealed in Ben's film. The other night when the Artangel opening was, actually my wife had to almost force me out the door, because and it was just odd to reveal that I did have this sort of little private space, directing, and I think because I'm so interested in the kind of structure of film, like my films, and this one's no exception. There's a kind of level of deconstruction as much as towards the possible film as a film sort of talking about sort of there's a certain influence of various disciplines from quantum mechanics to anthropology, and on into animism. It's about these sort of astronauts who arrive in this kind of Martian type landscape, which has these quite amazing grottos and things, and are sort of confronted by the indigenous inhabitants, who actually, rather than being some sort of primal cave type people, are actually possibly post the fall of humanity. And there's an interesting violent confrontation, which is almost a kind of, for me, was asking the question, if Columbus was to sort of go to the New World a second time, and people knew what had happened the first time, how would the reception be manifestly different? While also, there's lots of other things. My films tend to have quite a lot of layers, but then I'm not very into didactics. But I was also looking a lot at sort of Moroccan pre-Islamic animism to think about the sort of choreography of the piece. There's elements of sort of Beckett's Not I in terms of a voiceover that's delivered sort of framed on the lips, of which you'll see shortly. So, it was, I had a very definite kind of objective, aesthetic, mine, unlike Ben's, and I generally work across sort of almost hybridizing or being quite mongrel with formats I use. So my film's a mixture of sort of quite high-end digital shot on an Arri Alexa, and then Super 16, which I shot myself on what I call a prepared camera. So kind of similar to what Ben does in the processing, sometimes I'll do to the camera for the shooting. I'll do something to the mechanism so it doesn't shoot properly.
And that creates visual effects.
And that creates...
You don't necessarily know what they will be.
Exactly,
until you
and it's
develop
that sort of loss of control, so, which also is often there in the kind of musical scores of my films, because I have quite a strong interest in improv and experimental music, so I'm usually working with improvised musicians, and, this film's no exception, where we're doing sort of one-take recordings and that kind of thing.
I was interested about the site itself, the beach, 'cause it's so dramatic, and kind of how you came across that and what brought you to that.
I think it's probably about 15 years ago now that I first visited the site. It's a place called Sidi Ifni in southern Morocco, about a couple of hours south of Agadir. And when I first went, 15 years ago, it was I've been sort of backwards and forwards to Morocco. It's actually the second film I've made there over that time span, but at the time it was an NGO worker friend of mine who said, you must go to this place. And it was quite an amazing journey. I kind of went down there. There's a friend of mine who's a boy, he's a really interesting chap I know in Morocco. He's a boy from the home counties, who's a sort of gay Islamic convert, if that isn't a kind of oxymoron. And we drove down together, like overnight to Agadir, and slept in some deserted farm. And this was 15 years ago. There wasn't a proper road down to Sidi Ifni. In fact, and also 15 years ago, what was quite interesting was that Sidi Ifni had been a Spanish colony. It only actually reverted to Morocco in the 60s. And when I first visited 15 years ago, you entered Sidi Ifni, and there was still a signboard up saying you were now exiting French Morocco, you were now entering Spanish Morocco, which has obviously subsequently been taken down, but in Ifni, everyone speaks Spanish still. And, it was 15 years ago, this sort of outsider enclave with, which still had a tense relationship with the sort of Moroccan government proper. Also, it's not far from the disputed border with the Western Sahara. So it's got a very interesting set of histories, and Sidi Ifni was also Franco's colony in North Africa. So it's actually this tiny, sleepy kind of seaside town which has big boulevards for fascist marches back in the day. So it's these weird crisscrosses of history. And I mean, I always, when I'm looking for a site to film, I'm always looking for those sort of layers. They might not make it into the final film, but I like them as an echo, a sort of reverberation of kind of strata. Which you can see even the sound, we were trying to sort of to speak to that strata in a more liminal way. And I guess that's, I sort of woke up in what was then the kind of one place you could stay called La Suerte Loca, sort of mad wind, because they say everyone's mad in Sidi Ifni because of this particular sort of Atlantic wind that comes in. And at the time, I think I first went there was a strike on in Ifni. They were striking against the Moroccan government, sort of demanding that a fish cannery be built to help with their unemployment problem. And it was really like the end of the world. And you have this amazing kind of, not anymore, it's not up there anymore, sorry, pointing to something that's not there. But you have this just amazing kind of topography and geology. And interestingly, a lot of kind of pre-Islamic cults in Morocco, the sort of Berber animism was related to the grotto, this concept of spirits dwelling in caves. And so for me, I wanted to sort of bring those ghosts to bear, this idea of, the choreography where they're sort of stamping on the rocks, almost like a sort of, almost as a sort of alternate form of communication to kind of the spoken word, like through the landscape itself. And that was,
And the language that they're speaking there, it's
Berber. Yeah, it's the Berber dialect of Tamazight. And, I spent ages, literally years trying to figure out what language to make the film in. And originally I was going to make 3 versions, one in French, one in Spanish, and one in Arabic. And then I got really interested in, there'd been quite a debate in Morocco for a number of years about basically Morocco's the first North African country to make a Berber dialect an official state language. There's been sort of Berber movements for autonomy or recognition for years in sort of Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, and Morocco finally took this quite progressive step of making Tamazight, the dialect that's in the film, an official state language. But even that was delayed for a number of years because it's been oral for 500 years.
Which was part of the reason why Paul Bowles translated
A lot of
Marabet's work as well.
Marabet's Berber, so there's this idea of something, having that sort of ephemeral quality, but actually it turns out to be an official state language. You need to have a written form. And so there was this big debate in Morocco, and obviously French was discounted very quickly as the script, or the Latin script was discounted as a written form because it was the script of the colonizer. But then, interestingly, the Arabs had colonized the Berbers. So by the same logic, they had to dismiss the Arabic script. And then, interestingly, they reverted to a script that basically exists in rock carvings in the Yagur Plateau in the Atlas Mountains that dates back to sort of 2,000 years ago. And they sort of did that as the written form. And for me, that kind of clinched the language aspect of the film, because if I'd been, before engaging with that debate, I'd been thinking about this idea of past, future, and simultaneity. And then suddenly the language kind of asserted itself as this script that was taken from the ancient past and brought into the present. And interestingly, its closest sort of relatives are sort of ancient Greek or cuneiforms in terms of, and suddenly you realize that, for me that became this sort of wonderful case study in actually revealing a sort of quantum possibility, that nothing is as stable or as linear, which is very much a kind of trope in the film.
And the perspective is kind of blurred as well in the film. You're not quite sure sort of what perspective are you looking at, from the alien's perspective or the sort of, I guess, in local inhabitants kind of perspective as well.
Well, I wanted to break down those sort of, typical binary constructs, whether of past or future, or, native and invading, and actually, I mean, the sort of lips to camera you see in that clip were, one of the sort of quote unquote indigenous figures, but actually over the course of the whole film it switches, so you're getting the lips of these sort of blue-skinned aliens versus the sort of indigenous people, and at points the dialogue that you would expect from one camp is actually emerging from the other, and it's this, I wanted to sort of loop that back, that there was a lot of theories that were informing the film. I mean, you might say, why they're blue-skinned aliens in the first place?
That was going to be my next question.
And
it's a good answer.
It's a good answer in itself. Blue-skinned aliens. I mean, I was very interested in these sort of successive theories of mythic archetypes, I guess I'd call them. Basically, in the British Museum, there's a collection of objects that got me started, which all date from the 18th century, and a group of aristocratic British collectors. Basically, there'd been these new archaeological digs in Central America that had revealed these sort of objects, and these collectors sort of matched them to objects they had from sort of ancient India and ancient Egypt, and sort of put forward this theory that there was basically a Bermuda Triangle from which all human religion mythology emerged, which was connected by North Africa, Central America, and ancient India. And obviously because they all have blue-skinned gods. So you have Krishna in ancient India, you have Quetzalcoatl amongst the Aztecs, and you have Osiris in ancient Egypt. And they're all kind of gods who have a sort of phoenix-like quality of coming back from the dead, and that's also part of their blue, the reason why they're blue. So there's this sort of, savior second coming aspect. So you can see how the theory emerges that, even Christianity and even sort of Norse mythology become latter day sort of echoes of that. And then interestingly, they were stuck about how these cultures kind of connected, so they kind of came up with the kind of easy, kind of slightly dubious proposition that it was Phoenician merchant traders who connected them up. And Phoenicia being modern-day Lebanon, the improvised musician I used is a guy called Rayed Yassin, who's a dear friend and an improv musician from Beirut and an artist. So, that the pieces of the puzzle started to come together in that way. And the ancient astronaut theory then comes later. You've got sort of, I suppose, first Jung's talking about the collective unconscious, and that's how common religious archetypes occur. But then you've got the kind of more populist Erich von Daniken in the 60s, who wrote a book called Chariots of the Gods, where he suggested that ancient astronauts had visited Earth at key points in civilization to kind of push things forward, and hence you have all these sort of statuary and all these gods were actually alien visitors, which is wonderfully speculative and problematic, but interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting nevertheless.
Aliens are obviously something that fascinates you. Your last film, Piercing Brightness, was sort of all about kind of aliens coming to Preston, of all places. And I guess the otherworldly sort of finds its way into your films, particularly with slow action. I guess sort of what brings you to that kind of speculative fiction and that side of things?
I don't know, but it's one of the things that brings us together. I think one of the things that we talk about a lot other than films is also different kinds of speculative fiction. I guess we've both read a lot. I think it's a way of, for me it's it's a way of dealing with the sort of mess of now, is to think of how one might adapt in order to deal with the changes that are taking place, and think about the future in a kind of actually with some sort of positivity, thinking about how we can adapt and how we might come up with new rituals and things to deal with a sort of post-capitalist world, if that's ever possible.
I think, for me, sort of genre fiction or speculative fiction at its best is always a sort of critique of the present. And it's, in a way, somehow that sort of veil allows a kind of more cogent critique of the present than might otherwise be permitted. And for me, I definitely take that into film, because I guess a lot of my films are working in specific locations with communities and, mixture of professionals and non-professionals. And somehow the veneer of kind of genre or speculative fiction allows a much bigger reveal of context. People actually give of themselves much more, and I think, maybe it's also, a childhood spent in sort of Pakistan and India as well, where, for the man on the street, even the sort of whole Bollywood construct is an aspirational projection of the fantasy life of their everyday dreams, which you could argue is the case for cinema proper anyway. But I think for me, I kind of use it as an almost, dare I say it, documentary tool, where a lot of my films come out of a lot of discussion and workshopping. So I kind of almost see, I might go in with a particular genre or kind of map, but I've never filled it all in, and I'm always interested to see how people kind of react or take things on and become themselves perhaps more than in their everyday, and what that then reveals about a context, about a present, about a past and a future.
And well, obviously not so much with Preston, but with this film, I guess you've got the idea of sort of alien beings and also the exotic, which is kind of an interesting mixture. How do you approach that, and how often do you sort of think about, I guess, the responsibilities you have filming in a country where you've got sort of the big history of people coming over to Morocco and writing books about it and kind of being fascinated with the culture?
That was actually one of the I don't know, I think it's kind of at the core in a way of the feature version of what I've been doing, and I was thinking about it a lot in terms of the Bowles' relationship to Rabbit, because Bowles was there. He went to Morocco originally to record music. He's originally a composer before he's a writer. So he went there to record music, to share it, but I think also to use it as an influence for his own work. But then he started writing, and then he meets people like Rabbit and Mohammed Shukri and a bunch of other people and other local writers, and He's not actually translating Berber. He's translating Arabic Maghrebi from the north. And you know, there is this kind of definite problematic about you know, what he's taking, what he's giving to Rabbit, but what he's also taking, and you know, this, you know, he is a privileged Westerner who is going to this place and in a sense you know, taking from it, and that stuff gets exported. You know, it goes back to the New World, and you know, for Rabbit, it's very sort of hazy area, because obviously Rabbit could have carried on being a waiter in bars for his life had he not met Bowles. But you know, he was telling me about his first book, Mahashish, which is a great collection of short stories, and I think there's something like, at a guess, there's 12 stories in it. And Rabbit said he recorded 20 stories.
Okay.
So he's like, what happened to the other 8? And I thought, you know, but he can't read or write. So he's at this kind of complete disadvantage of not knowing what Bowles translate, what he kind of takes as his own. But then within Bowles' own short stories, he then kind of doubles back and kind of talks about that, and A Distant Episode it's kind of at the core of that story, which is what I was so interested in and thinking about it. So in A Distant Episode, the story, it's about a linguist who's, you know, professor of language. He's going to this place to like research language, a particular, probably Berber language, and but this, you know, this guy, he's kind of pompous. He's not particularly nice. He's and he has the confidence of feeling like he can go anywhere and that place is his to take what he wants. You know, in the end, that comes back to bite him quite concretely on. And
brutal story, isn't
it's
it?
It's a very brutal story, and you know, I think Bowles is very aware of, you know, his own relationship to the character in that story, and you know, so then I kind of moved that just over to a filmmaker. It's a film about a filmmaker who kind of does the same thing. He's although he's not an arsehole, he's actually very nice, but he, you know, he has moved to Morocco and he's made it his own, and I was interested in that kind of relationship between, you know, the film director and there's a line in so when Oliver the filmmaker gets kidnapped and it goes through this kind of transformation, this kind of brutal transformation, one of the kidnappers, one of the bandits, says to him, you've been circling around trouble for a long time and now you've found it, which I thought was a very nice line. You know, I asked them to say something kind of equivalent to that, but not with that kind of poetic, which is just inherent in the language. They you know, a lot of the language is kind of metaphor. So yeah, there is this kind of you know, question of the kind of hubris of being an outsider and going somewhere else, which is something that I question myself. You know, but at the same time, you know, I question it, but it doesn't stop me from doing it.
And you almost seem to you take it sort of head on, like, you know, you're looking at these exotic places, and I suppose like with the sort of pyramids and things. Yeah, it's you know, it's a really interesting approach.
I suppose for me as well, there's a sort of, you know, I kind of think of it as almost actively creating an equivalence. You know, a Mexican pyramid or its Preston bus station, they're equally exotic. And I think for me, that's my way of dethroning any one particular almost centre of where my gaze is located. And maybe there's that quality in being a sort of immigrant who's lived in many places that actually quite naturally I don't operate from a centre in my thinking. And usually each film is, I mean, it's sort of unashamedly sort of going to places, but generally I embed myself in them for kind of, I mean, that's one of the longest, having first visited the site 15 years previously, but even like Preston, I was there for about 3 years. And it's that thing of kind of, and I like to sort of mess with the terms of engagement. So, as there's the sort of genuine aspects of kind of workshopping and really working with people and communities and kind of, in some cases, like detective work. With for the sort of alien aspects of Piercing Brightness, which was the film before this, I spent a lot of time with UFO investigation groups, conferences, went out to kind of investigate sightings. So there's a sort of going into it that, and equally, in terms of kind of rituals and things in Morocco and other places, there's both a kind of time spent in a place, but there's a sort of relationship to other kind of rituals I've participated in, other things that actually never make it into my films. There's all the background stuff which is perhaps as rich, but that's my private kind of, I guess, work experience, whatever you might want to call it. But then also I quite like bringing in things that have nothing to do with the context. And then they sometimes end up doing it, like, I like the spuriousness of the 18th century theory that it was Phoenicians that connected these 3 points on the compass, and so asking a friend from Beirut to do the music was a kind of a sort of claiming of that spurious theory. And then, interestingly, with Piercing Brightness, I really wanted to work on that soundtrack with the Japanese avant-garde band Acid Mother's Temple, who, as far as I knew, had nothing to do with Preston. And actually, an academic friend of mine at the University of Central Lancashire, I was having a drink with him one night, and it turned out he'd written his whole PhD on Japanese avant-garde music between art and performance, and said, "Oh my God, I think I have Makoto Kawabata's email, who's the frontman of Acid Mother's Temple." And so weirdly, next thing I knew, I had an email from Makoto saying, "I've heard you'd like to work with us. I like your work. Should we have a talk?" And so, Preston became the nexus of all alien influence that I was projecting in my film anyway. So I think the world makes itself. We have our ideas, and then the world either confirms or denies. And I think for me, it's sort of almost being open to that slipstream that is the kind of ethical, or perhaps, almost meta-ethical kind of compass.
I mean, ethnography seems to be sort of, I guess, a sort of mode of filmmaking that a lot of people are interested in at the moment. Not just sort of, I guess, yourselves, but also people like the Sensory Ethnography Lab at Harvard and people like that. I mean, do you feel that there's kind of a particular interest kind of in that at the moment? Do you feel sort of part of that? Do you sort of see yourselves as distant from it, or?
I don't know. It's always hard to feel part of things. I mean, yeah, I guess I do have some affinity with the Sensory Ethnography Lab for sure. I mean, I know those people. I'm based in Harvard at the moment, so the sensory ethnography sound genius Ernst Carroll is mixing my latest 2 films. So yeah, I'm kind of closely related to them, but at the same time, they're all very much from anthropological backgrounds, which I am not. While I'm interested in it and I've watched a lot of ethnographic films, I'm also have been very sort of skeptical of it, and I'm not coming from that kind of scientific inquiry, and that can get me into trouble sometimes if I show it seminars like the Flaherty seminar or something, which is full of anthropologists and documentary filmmakers. And
how do they respond?
Well, some quite badly. Someone even said Ben Rivers, which really surprised me, because I thought I'd made this really quite joyful film about kids in Scotland, And this woman was so affronted by it because there was no context. It just dives in and then leaves them, and there's no explaining who they are, why they're there. You know, it's a 20-minute onslaught of a fragment of their lives, which felt right to me. But it's funny when you're confronted with people who are from a very specific field, and they want a kind of factual explanation. They can be kind of affronted, scared, I don't know, by that. So, you know, I might kind of skirt near it, and I might kind of even directly reference it sometimes, or and there are certain ethnographic filmmakers like Jean Rouge who are really trying to push what that means, coming from that scientific background. You know, I feel more closely related to them, and that's kind of what the Sensory Ethnography Lab are doing. They're kind of trying to move it away from being descriptive and making it sensorial. I mean, it makes much more sense to me that it's about kind of being in a moment.
Yeah, I think I find myself in a very tricky situation, you know, vis-a-vis, I guess, what you'd almost call a current vogue for ethnography. Both because, on the one hand, I see, you know, certain kind of artists or filmmakers jumping on the bandwagon, and I find that somehow a bit shallow. And then on the flip side, I've had a parallel career in academia for a decade or so, and so I have various sort of academic friends, but I'm always trying to sort of subvert what I see as a sort of dogmatic approach to kind of, or the specificity to particular areas of inquiry. So, you know, I think there's a sort of, I don't know, it's almost, I try and balance a kind of rigorous approach, but with a sort of poetics, which I think is really important. Because without a sort of poetics, why should anybody sit and watch the damn thing? And I do sort of, you know, run into trouble with academic friends, but then I'm also kind of courting it. So I'm often sort of teasing academic friends of mine for being so, you know, disciplined by their discipline. And I always think that kind of, and I'm probably going to alienate some people tonight by saying this, but also, you know, whether it's Jean Rouge, or one of the key influences for me in this film as well was Pierre Clastres. And I don't feel the anthropological establishment has ever forgiven him or caught up with him since the 70s. And I don't know if many people know Clastres. He was a student of Levi-Strauss and a real maverick anthropologist, and, you know, really set the cat amongst the pigeons. But, you know, I remember it was actually a former student of mine who told me I should read him first. And his kind of, I guess, magnum opus is a book called Society Against the State, where he puts forward this kind of radical. I don't necessarily fully believe it, but I love its kind of radicalism. And he basically suggests that sort of so-called primitive tribes, you know, the sort of classic thinking of Levi-Strauss and previously was that primitive tribes engage in perpetual warfare as a condition of their kind of their level of advancement of their societies. And he kind of overturned that and actually suggested that rather than thinking of those societies as primitive, he actually suggested that they were very sophisticated and nuanced, and they engaged in perpetual warfare as an active resistance to the formation of a state apparatus and the bureaucracy that would come with it. And you've got to love that, you know, whether you believe it or not. It's a beautiful kind of and poetic approach to the discipline. But, you know, I mean, he was, you know, yeah. I mean, the anthropological establishment hated him with a vengeance, and I think it's only just starting to be able to even go near what some of the things he broached.
It's interesting. I mean, some of the Paul Bowles' stories still seem very shocking sort of today, in the way that some of Jean Rouge's films kind of still do. That's kind of interesting that something can have that sort of power for so long, I guess. One thing I was wondering about was the sound in your films. We talked a little bit about that earlier. Ben, I guess your decision not to sort of have any sound, like actual sound, sort of sync sound on set. So I'm wondering sort of where that kind of came from.
Yeah, I know, because I took my assistant with me and I taught her how to use the... Oh, no, I didn't teach her how to... she was carrying this, like, you know, big boom type thing and the sound recorder. And I don't know, it was really an instinctive decision on on the shoot. She kept asking me, when are you going to show me how to use this? And I thought, I'll show you later. And, you know, got to the end of the week and she still didn't know how to use it. I just felt like it wasn't...
That's poor capacity building, Ben.
I know. But, you know, she helped me in lots of other ways. So, yeah, I don't know. I felt like, and it was something that I did with slow action as well. You know, I went to these very distant spots around the earth, and again, I didn't record anything. It was just a feeling that this was something that needed to be kind of constructed after the fact. And I think it was partly to do with this kind of distancing and not being tied to an idea of observation. You know, as soon as you put a kind of illustrative sound, you know, on an image, it really transforms it. It becomes about, you know, about that moment. And I wanted it to be much more otherworldly, you know, so I didn't want any sync sound or sound from that place at all. So, yeah, it was...
and I guess you also, in slow action, you sort of, I think you use some soundtracks from other films.
It's almost entirely, I think it's almost entirely like manipulated bits and bobs from other films, plus obviously the narration, which I did record. But yeah, all the kind of noises and music and stuff, it's all just stolen.
It's quite an interesting way to quote from a film, I think, because obviously most people quote like with dialogue or evoke other films with dialogue or visuals, perhaps, but not so much with sort of soundtracks.
Yeah. Well, there's so much good stuff there, and it's harder to recognise, so it's easier to get away with. Yeah, I mean, sound is always. I think it's really important for both of us in terms of, you know, how it can manipulate and change your relationship to the image, and you know, we're both interested in as Shed said, like experimental music, and you know, so. But usually I don't. I kind of veer away from music, and I'm more interested in a kind of music concrete type way of working, a kind of collage of sounds to make a kind of music. Yeah, with this one, like I said, it just was perfect. It was a ready-made that needed nothing doing to it, and it felt right.
And how, I mean, I don't know where you are with making the feature film, but can you say anything about how sound will figure in that? Or
it's a little different. It kind of moves between being in sync and then kind of moving out of sync. So it's a kind of you know, you get drawn into maybe one way of looking, and then it pulls you out, and you're looking from another angle around the back or something. Because you know, the idea is that you see this film being made, but there are so many kind of levels of reality and fiction in what's happening in the edit and these shots. You don't know if I've set some things up, or if these are just happening, or so it kind of so the first half of the film is based around this other film being made by Oliver, and then it shifts and moves almost entirely into a fiction. So with the first half, I'm trying to kind of preempt what happens in the second half a little bit with the use of sound, but we're still working on it now, so it's a bit hard to talk about it.
And I mean, we saw sort of like with your approach to Shezad's film that you see a sort of scene, and you're not quite sure whether it's the film or the filmmaking, and then you can see the sort of artifice behind it, which is sort of like we saw in Vampire Kek as well. Is that an approach you'll be taking in the film a bit too?
Yeah. You don't really see the actual like apparatus that much. You don't really see. There might be a couple of shots where there's a camera. You see the big fluffy boom sometimes, or groups of people. I mean, that's what I like. You know, the shot where in that last clip where they're on the beach and there's this like huddle of people and there's these kind of reflectors, so that, and there's the Shez's DP is kind of doing all these kind of like put this here and it's this weird kind of ritual thing that you don't know exactly what's happening, but it's it's a group that's somehow in sync.
It kind of reminds me a little bit. I mean, your other films are sort of often about kind of hermetic worlds that are sort of apart from everything, and in a way, filmmaking is kind of like that.
Yeah,
here,
very
right?
much, yeah. No, it is. It's its own little, ritualistic body of people that there's some shots where you see this happening and with this intensity, but then in the background there's people wandering along the beach, on holiday. There's some policemen, just kind of walking down the beach. So yeah, it's this strange kind of, it is a little world.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of interesting way in which we're both interested in artifice, but it manifests quite differently.
Yeah, it does.
What's it like for you to see them sort of side by side, and do you think that in the future they will ever be seen in that context?
We have talked about it, haven't we? We've sort of, in the last year maybe sort of speculated about doing like a sort of two-person show at a museum or something that, this is the obvious one because there's a sort of total mirroring, but, there's definitely other works of ours that have danced around or skirted over each other in terms of very much our sort of conversation, and that sort of maybe a sort of, and correct me if I'm wrong, a slight desire to kind of make that conversation more public.
Mm-hmm.